Drawing feathers can be difficult, especially because there are so many different types and colours. This eagle actually has about 4 different types of feathers, and you can see the difference between the head and the neck and the wing and the back. But I drew all the feathers using the same process, which makes things quite a lot easier when you're drawing different kinds of birds and feathers, because you can apply these techniques to any bird that you're drawing. So I'm starting out by using my pan pastels to create an underpainting. For this, I'm using a smaller soft tool, that's SOFT, to apply the pastel. And these tools are specifically made for applying the pans. I do have quite a lot of tutorials on how to use the pan pastels if you're interested as well, so you can check those out if you want to know a little bit more. But I'm starting with the darkest areas first. And the idea of an underpainting is basically to map out where all of those colours are going, where the lights are and where the darks are, and just generally adding some colour to the entire subject so that you have a nice base to work from. I'm not worried about details or getting the perfect colour at this point. I'm also saving my brightest highlights and darkest shadows for the last few layers of the drawing. And the reason for this is because I want to be able to start with a more mid-tone colour as my base layer, so that way when I add my details and highlights on top, it will actually show up. If I added a pure white in the base layer, for example, I wouldn't be able to add those white highlights or white details on top because you wouldn't see it on top of that white base layer. So even in the lightest areas, I'm actually using a light grey or a blue, or just not pure white. So sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming to know where to start on a drawing, especially with something like this where it's a bit complicated with all the different feathers. So for me personally, the easiest way to get started on a drawing is to pick an area that looks obvious to me in the reference photo. For example, the darkest areas stood out to me, so I'm blocking in those areas first, and then I'll choose another colour that stands out to me, and then block in that colour. So I noticed a dark area around the eye first, so I started there, and then while I'm using that colour, I'm looking everywhere else to see if there is any of this colour on the reference photo that I can add this colour to before moving on to the next colour. So throughout my process, I do tend to exaggerate my colours quite a lot. So I have added quite a lot of blues and reds in my base layer to make it look a little bit more interesting. A lot of people have asked me why they can't seem to add pastel pencil on top of their pan pastel layer like I do in my tutorials. And the main reason that you might be struggling to add that pastel pencil on top is if you've added too much pastel in the underpainting. So I'm only adding a very light layer of pastel at this point, and there's quite a lot of paper still showing through. If you add too much pastel, you'll fill up those little grooves of the paper, and your pencil won't be able to stick on top of that. So before moving on to the pastel pencil layer, I'm also going to blend this layer of pan pastel using a cotton tip, and this actually helps push that pastel into the little grooves of the paper. When I draw feathers, I'm not trying to copy every feather in my reference photo exactly. I'm just trying to get the general idea of the shape and the size and the direction. It really doesn't matter too much if you miss a feather here and there, as long as you've got the general gist of what those feathers look like in each area. In the first few layers, I'm applying the same techniques to each of the different types of feathers over this eagle. The only thing that's different is the size and the shape of the feathers. I've used similar colours throughout the first few layers, so the drawing looks cohesive, but the feathers on the head are much smaller in comparison to the neck, which has really long, skinny feathers. The back has larger, more defined feathers, and the wing has small, tight feathers. But despite all of these different types of feathers, I'm actually using the same process of blocking in my colours first, just paying attention to the size and the shape of the feathers. During the middle layers of pastel pencil, I'm defining the feathers a little bit more, so I'm still not adding too many details at this point. I'm just trying to focus on getting those shapes and colours and values right. So your values or your shadows and highlights are probably the most important thing when you're trying to make your artwork look realistic. A lot of people tend to focus on picking the perfect colour or adding as many details as they can to try and make their artwork look more realistic, when in reality it's actually your proportions and your values that make something look realistic. I don't spend hundreds of hours adding tons of detail. In fact, I actually spend less than 5 hours on each piece. I also tend to add a lot more exaggerated colors like blues and purples and reds and things that are not very obvious in the reference photo. But even though I don't use super accurate colors or add heaps of details, my artwork looks realistic from a normal viewing distance because my values are correct. You can alter your colors as long as the color that you choose is not too dark or too light in comparison to that area of your reference photo. Now that I'm moving on to the details, I'm focusing on adding a few more details towards the face, especially the eye area. Having more detail in a specific area can actually help draw the viewer's attention to that area, so I'm purposely not adding as much detail to the body. And like I was talking about earlier, I'm not adding every single little detail that I can see in the reference photo. I'm taking a step back every now and then, and I'm looking at my artwork from a few steps back to see if the details that I'm adding can actually be seen from a normal viewing distance. And if I can't see the details that I'm adding, and then they probably don't need to be there. When I take a step back, I'm having a look to see if I have the general gist of the feathers in each section correct, and then I'm altering them slightly if they don't look quite right. For example, the feathers on the head are shorter and more pointy than in other areas, so I'm making sure that I can see those highlighted tips from a few steps back, but I don't have to add every little detail there. The feathers on the neck are a little fluffier, so I'm adding a few wispy strands to make it look a little bit fluffier from a distance. And the feathers on the back are a bit larger and a little bit more well defined, so I'm making sure that my edges are a little bit more crisp on those feathers. But the main thing that I'm focusing on is my values. I'm really making sure that my dark areas are dark enough and my highlights are light enough. Something I do quite often to check if my shadows and highlights are accurate, and this is something that I tell my students to do all the time as well, is to actually take a photo of your artwork and then turn it into black and white and compare it side by side with a black and white version of your reference photo. This way you've taken out the aspect of the color and you can actually just focus on your shadows and highlights. You'll be able to see if those areas are dark enough or light enough, and you can alter them from there. Most of the time people get their highlights correct, but it's the dark areas that people seem to have a problem with. They either don't realize they're not going as dark as they need to, or they're just too scared to go that dark. So this way it really helps you be able to check and see if your values are right. Another problem that a lot of my students have come across is drawing white feathers, and it can be difficult to know what colors to use and how to make a white subject look realistic and interesting. So I've created a tutorial in the top left of the screen where I give you some really useful tips for drawing white feathers. So click on that and I'll see you over there.